As the Gaelic world grew more defined, its people found themselves navigating a landscape where honor, loyalty, and protection were not just ideals, but necessities for survival. Sit back, relax, and picture this next chapter unfolding beneath a grey sky where the wind rolls over open fields and distant hilltops glow with early morning firelight. In this world, the concept of the Taith, a small, kin-based territory ruled by a chieftain, became the backbone of Gaelic society. Some researchers believe these Tuatha operated almost like miniature kingdoms, fiercely independent yet interconnected through webs of marriage, alliance, and obligation. Others suggest they were fluid, shifting units that rose and fell with the fortunes of powerful families. Whatever the truth, within each Taith, every person had a place, a role, and a set of responsibilities that shaped daily life. The chieftain, or Iri, held authority not through absolute power but through respect, reputation, and the ability to keep peace among his people. He settled disputes, led in times of war, and ensured that justice, measured through complex systems of compensation and honor, was upheld. Beneath him were nobles, warriors, farmers, craftsmen, and poets, each contributing to a delicate balance that kept the community functioning. Imagine a dispute arising over stolen cattle. Tensions flare. Warriors tighten their grips on spears. Elders gather under an oak tree, and the air is thick with expectation. Rather than plunging into chaos, the Gaels turned to their intricate legal traditions, early forms of Brehon law to determine restitution. Some scholars believe these laws were among the most advanced legal systems in early Europe, emphasizing compensation over punishment, reputation over brute force. Others argue they were flexible, evolving with each generation's needs. Meanwhile, standing at the heart of community life were the warriors who defended the Taith. Often young, restless, and eager to prove themselves, they formed bonds that transcended kinship. Their training honed their skills with spear, sword, and shield, tools that carried not only the weight of battle, but also the symbolism of status and heritage. And in the shadows of these warriors stood another influential group, the bards and druids, keepers of memory and ritual. Through poetry, prophecy, and tradition, they reinforced the values of the Taith, preserving stories of ancestors, victories, and tragedies that shaped identity itself. But even as order held firm within these small territories, danger loomed just beyond the next hill. Rival Tuatha competed for grazing lands, alliances crumbled under the strain of ambition, and raiding became an accepted, sometimes expected part of life. How, then, did a society built on honor navigate a world where conflict was never far away? As we move deeper into the story, that question will guide us toward the evolving Gaelic warrior culture and the forces that would soon begin reshaping their world forever. To understand how the Gaels endured in a world where conflict drifted through the air like wood smoke, we must step into the heart of their warrior culture, a world defined by skill, reputation, and the ever-shifting lines between protection and aggression. Sit back, relax, and imagine dawn breaking over a rugged hillside, the world tinted with cold blue light as young warriors prepare for another day's training. Spears clatter against wooden shields, shouts echo across the valley, and the scent of damp earth rises as feet dig into the soil. Some researchers believe Gaelic warfare was shaped less by the desire for conquest and more by the need to defend cattle. Territory and honor, the three pillars upon which society was built. Others suggest that raiding, ritualized violence, and displays of bravery served as both economic strategies and social rites of passage. marking the transition from youth to adulthood in a world that respected physical skill as much as wisdom. Warfare among the Gaels was not the massive, organized spectacle that would later define Roman campaigns. Instead, it played out in swift, targeted skirmishes, fought by warriors who understood every bend of their landscape. Imagine small bands, moving with fluid silence through forests and boglands, their cloaks blending with the mist, their footsteps cushioned by wet moss and heather. When battle came, it was sudden and fierce, spear tips flashing, shields shuddering with impact, war cries rising over the flat expanse of open field. And yet, beneath this intensity lay a code, rules that dictated when raids could occur, who could be targeted, and how disputes were settled afterward. Some scholars argue that these regulations were part of a deeply moral system, where violence was controlled and purposeful rather than reckless. Others believed they were practical responses to life in a landscape where no Taith could afford endless bloodshed. Fearless as they were, the warriors did not stand alone. They were shaped and guided by poets the Philid, who wielded words with as much force as any blade. A poem praising a warrior could elevate him to legend. A satire could destroy his reputation, leaving wounds deeper than spear thrusts. It was a world where memory was power, where ancestry was weaponized through song, and where stories preserved victories long after bodies returned to the earth. And hovering at the edge of this cultural web were the Druids, figures both revered and misunderstood. Some researchers imagine them as legal experts, philosophers, and ritual specialists who mediated disputes and guided kings. Others see them as more mysterious keepers of celestial knowledge, interpreters of omens, and custodians of the sacred groves that dotted the landscape. But even as this rich warrior culture thrived, the Gaels faced an unavoidable truth. No Taith, no matter how formidable, could remain isolated forever. Rising populations, shifting alliances, and increasing contact with the outside world were beginning to reshape the very foundations of Gaelic society. What happened when isolated tribes encountered new beliefs, new threats, and new opportunities is the next chapter in their unfolding story, and it would test their resilience in ways they had never known, as the Gaels expanded their territories and sharpened their warrior traditions. A quieter transformation began to unfold, one shaped not by conflict, but by contact, curiosity, and the slow weaving of cultural exchange. Sit back, relax, and imagine merchants moving along coastal inlets and river mouths, their small boats carved with patterns that glimmered in the shifting light. Imagine foreign goods amber from the Baltic, wine from Gaul, delicate glass beads from distant workshops surviving in settlements that once felt worlds away from the centers of European trade. Some researchers believe these networks existed far earlier than once imagined, linking the Gaelic world to the broader tapestry of Iron Age Europe. Others suggest the exchanges were limited, sporadic, and mediated by a handful of elite families who controlled the flow of precious goods. Whatever the truth, these contacts nudged Gaelic society toward greater complexity, introducing new technologies, new materials, and new ideas that ripple through the archaeological record today. Iron tools replaced older bronze implements, reshaping farming, warfare, and craftsmanship. Hilltop forts grew larger and more elaborate, reflecting rising populations and mounting pressures between tribes. And with every ship that touched a Gaelic shore, traveled stories of powerful kingdoms across the sea, of armies that marched in disciplined ranks, of gods worshipped in stone temples rather than sacred groves. Such ideas did not erase Gaelic traditions, but they added layers, shadows, and possibilities. Yet contact also created vulnerability. Traders brought more than goods, they carried news of Roman expansion, of legions moving westwards with an unstoppable hunger, of lands conquered and cultures reshaped. Some historians believe that rumors of Rome reached Ireland long before Roman soldiers ever set foot near its shores. Others propose that Irish chieftains actively sought alliances or knowledge from traders, curious about a power so vast it could alter the fate of entire nations. As these whispers grew, Gaelic leaders began to reconsider the world around them. How would their Tuatha, small, independent, proud, fare against the storm gathering beyond the horizon? Would the warrior bands that once defended cattle herds stand strong against armies disciplined beyond anything they had ever imagined? And in this uncertainty, Gaelic society turned inward, strengthening old traditions, expanding ringforts, refining legal systems, and reinforcing cultural identity, as if preparing for a test they could sense but not yet name. This was a moment suspended between peace and unknown threat. A moment when the world was growing larger, louder, and more interconnected with every passing generation. And as we move deeper into their story, we reach a turning point, the rise of kingdoms where power would consolidate. Leaders would emerge from rival clans, and the shape of Gaelic identity would shift from scattered tribes toward something far more enduring, transformation that would carry the Gaels into the early medieval world. As the expedition pressed deeper into the heart of the forsaken lands, the world around them seemed to shift in ways that defied logic, as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched thin by something ancient and hungry lurking beneath the soil, waiting for the slightest tremor of attention to awaken fully. The trees grew twisted and hollow, their bark split open like old wounds that still wept sap thick as blood, and the wind carried strange murmurs that did not belong to any language spoken by humankind, but echoed with an intelligence that made the skin crawl. The boy, pale withdrawn, with eyes too wide and too knowing, walked with a quiet ease as though he recognized every sound, every shadow, every subtle movement around them. He did not look afraid, and that frightened the men more than anything else. They whispered among themselves, trying to understand how a child so frail could move through the wilderness without fatigue, without hunger, without fear, and why animals hid the moment he passed, as though avoiding something they instinctively knew was wrong. Dr. Harrow kept watching him with a conflicted mind, part fascination, part dread, because the patterns forming were impossible to ignore. Whenever the child grew distressed, even slightly, the air would shift, the temperature would drop, and the men's tools would malfunction, compasses spinning wildly, lanterns flickering until they sputtered out. The rational explanations were thinning with each incident, leaving Harrow to confront the possibility that what they were witnessing was neither disease nor deformity, but some biological anomaly beyond the boundaries of current science. One night, as the group settled near a shallow stream, Harrow noticed the boy staring into the water, not at his reflection, but into the depths beneath it, as though something there was staring back. The surface trembled not from wind and the ripples, spread outward in perfect concentric circles that did not distort or break. Harrow approached slowly, the hairs on his arms rising, and asked the child what he saw. The boy answered in a soft voice that something down there was following them, something that had known him before he was born. The men overheard, and terror seized the camp, though no one dared admit it aloud. As they moved on the next morning, the land grew quieter. To quiet no birdsong, no insects, no flowing water, and the sky darkened despite the clear horizon. Harrow realized they were approaching the place the boy had been trying, in his own way, to avoid. This was where the truth lived. And the truth, he feared, would not let any of them leave untouched. The deeper they ventured into that silent stretch of land, the more the world seemed to decay around them, as though the environment itself were recoiling from their presence or warning them to turn back before they crossed a threshold that was never meant to be approached by human feet. The soil turned black and soft like ash mixed with something living, releasing faint pulses of warmth when stepped on, and the trees thinned out until the remaining ones leaned in strange angles as if bent by a force that pulled from below rather than above. The boy walked ahead without looking back, his small figure cutting a pale path through the dim landscape, his steps synchronized with the unsettling throb of the ground, almost as if he and the earth shared a heartbeat. Dr. Harrow's mind spiraled through every scientific principle he had ever trusted, trying to make sense of the anomalies stacking around them, but with each mile, the evidence suggested that what they were approaching was not a location but a phenomenon, one that might predate the very ecosystems science attempted to categorize. The men behind him muttered prayers under their breath, gripping their rifles with knuckles drained of color, but they understood at this point that bullets would be as useless as fear. By noon, the air grew thick, syrupy, difficult to breathe, and an invisible pressure clamped around their chests, forcing them to gasp for breath like men drowning in humidity that had no source. The landscape ahead dipped into a shallow basin where the light dimmed unnaturally, not from clouds but from an absence of reflection, as though the world refused to illuminate this region. In the center of the basin stood a formation half-mound, half-broken structure that looked like it had been grown, not built, its surface made of interlocking organic ridges that pulsed faintly with life. The boy slowed, his shoulders trembling, not with fear but with recognition. He whispered, "This is where it began." Harrow stepped beside him, fighting the instinct to retreat, and asked what he meant. The child's eyes glistened with a mixture of sorrow and certainty as he explained that this was where he had come from, not in the way a child comes from a mother, but in the way a spark comes from a storm. The men behind them froze, realizing they had crossed into a realm where human origin stories held no value. As a low rumble shivered through the ground, the mound responded as if sensing the boy's return, awakening something ancient beneath it. Harrow knew then that their mission had changed. They were no longer exploring, they were trespassing. The rumble beneath their feet did not fade as natural tremors do. Instead, it swelled slowly, with the slow, deliberate certainty of something awakening after an age of dormancy, and the men instinctively staggered back, even though they knew retreat was pointless now. The mound before them began to emit a faint, rhythmic glow, each pulse matching the cadence of a heartbeat far too large and far too old to belong to anything human. And Dr. Harrow felt his stomach twist as he realized the boy's presence wasn't merely recognized, it was summoned. The air thinned further until every breath tasted metallic, like inhaling rust, and the wind died entirely, leaving the basin trapped in a suffocating stillness that made even sound seem afraid to move. The boy stepped forward, compelled by an invisible force. And when Harrow tried to grasp his arm, his hand passed through a sudden distortion in the air, like a pocket of displaced density that rejected human contact, yet accepted the child with ease. Harrow stumbled back, shaken, and the men behind him murmured in panic, asking whether they should intervene, but their leader could only shake his head because intervention now felt equivalent to striking a match in a room full of ancient gas. As the boy reached the base of the mound, the pulsating ridges shifted. folding and unfurling like the gills of a living organism that had learned to mimic architecture, revealing layers of smooth, bone-colored interior that spiraled downward into an unseen depth. The formation emitted a low, resonant hum that reverberated in their ribs, a sound that wasn't heard with the ears but felt through the body, vibrating against marrow and memory. The child placed his hand on the surface, and the mound responded like soft flesh warming beneath a familiar touch, opening further to create an entrance shaped not by design but by recognition. Harrow's mind raced through every forbidden corner of biological theories, energenesis, pre-human ecosystems, unknown symbiotic evolution, but none of them fit. None of them could explain why the structure behaved like a parent welcoming its offspring home. The boy turned to them with eyes dimmed by melancholy rather than fear and whispered, "It remembers me." Before Harrow could question him, a cold wind finally swept across the basin, carrying with it faint echoes, voices, or something imitating voices, calling from within the mound, layered, ancient, almost pleading. The men recoiled, crossing themselves, gripping their weapons as though wooden stocks could anchor them to sanity. Yet Harrow felt only the pull of truth, terrible and irresistible. Whatever lay inside that living hollow would reshape their understanding of the world. But as the ground trembled again, harder this time, he wondered whether humanity was meant to understand it at all. The entrance widened with a slow, deliberate motion, like the dilation of an eye adjusting to light after centuries of darkness, and a deep breath of cold air exhaled from within, carrying with it the scent of minerals, old water and something faintly sweet, almost floral, yet unmistakably alien. The men hesitated at the threshold, but the boy stepped inside without a sound, his movement eerily fluid, as though he had rehearsed this moment in dreams long before his waking memory existed. Dr. Harrow followed, unable to stop himself, drawn by a mixture of scientific hunger and a more primal instinct that whispered this place held answers older than the soil covering it. As they entered, the walls pulsated with dim light that traveled through vein-like channels embedded in the organic structure, illuminating a cavern that seemed neither hollowed nor built but grown through a process no human biology had ever recorded. The air inside was dense but not suffocating, vibrating faintly as though carrying a frequency too low for the human ear to decipher. And Harrow felt the hairs on his arms rise as a tingling sensation crawled across his skin. The men behind him shivered as their footsteps echoed softly, not against stone, but against a surface that absorbed sound and released it back a heartbeat later, slightly distorted, like an imperfect memory replayed. The deeper they walked, the more the structure narrowed into a corridor twisting gently like the inside of a shell, and Harrow noticed symbols etched along the interior spirals, branching lines, waveforms, patterns that resembled ancient carvings found in Neolithic sites, yet carried a biological fluidity, as if they had been grown, not inscribed. The boy traced one with his fingers, and the symbol glowed brighter, reacting to his touch while remaining dull under Harrow's. That reaction sent ripples of fear through the group. It meant the place wasn't just alive, it was aware. Far ahead, a low harmonic tone began to rise, composed of layered, resonant notes that were almost musical yet unsettlingly dissonant, as if multiple voices were trying to harmonize but had never heard human rhythm. The corridor opened into a vast chamber whose ceiling stretched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness threaded with faint glimmers like stars reflecting in black water. In the center stood a column of translucent material that pulsed with shifting colors, each hue sliding into the next like a slow aurora trapped within glass. And the boy's expression softened with a familiarity Harrow could not interpret. "This is where they kept me," the child whispered, his voice trembling not from fear but from a sorrow too heavy for someone his age. The men exchanged horrified glances, realizing this chamber was not a relic, it was an incubator, perhaps still functioning. As the harmonic sound deepened around them, Harrow felt the weight of countless unspoken possibilities pressing on his chest, forcing him to wonder whether the boy had been created here, or merely awakened. The pulse of light from the central column began to sync with the boy's breathing, faint at first, almost imperceptible, then growing more pronounced, casting elongated shadows that crawled across the chamber walls like living silhouettes. Dr. Harrow took careful steps closer, his mind a storm of wonder and dread, realizing that whatever energy animated this place defied every law of biology and physics he had spent his life studying. The air itself seemed to thrum, a low-frequency vibration that rattled teeth and made the very ground beneath their feet feel unstable, as though the cavern itself was aware of their intrusion and weighing their presence. The boy extended a hand toward the column, and as he did, the translucent surface rippled like water disturbed by a stone, revealing shapes within shapes that at first resembled human figures suspended in some viscous medium, their features twisted in expressionless agony, yet undeniably familiar. Harrow's stomach turned, a mixture of scientific fascination and revulsion, as he recognized anatomical details that were correct but slightly askew, as though evolution had been rewritten in miniature here. The harmonic tone shifted, layering multiple pitches that seemed to resonate directly with their nervous systems, and the men staggered involuntarily, gripping one another for balance, while the boy remained eerily composed, eyes fixed on the column with an intensity that made Harrow question whether the child understood far more than any human should. The walls themselves began to shimmer subtly, faint bioluminescence tracing the etched symbols as if responding to the presence of life in the room, forming patterns that resembled constellations, charts, or perhaps something resembling language, though Harrow could not decipher it. Every surface felt organic yet purposeful, like a fusion of architecture and living tissue. The space, both hospitable and hostile, comforting and threatening simultaneously. Harrow tried to record observations, notes fumbling in his hands as the surreal environment overwhelmed his usual discipline. Yet he felt compelled to understand, compelled to catalogue every detail, every vibration, every nuance of light and sound, because this chamber held knowledge beyond human comprehension, or perhaps knowledge that humans were never meant to hold. As the men watched, the boy pressed his palms against the column, and the suspended forms within stirred, subtle movements that sent shivers down their spines, suggesting awareness, memory, or perhaps consciousness. And in that instant, Harrow understood a terrifying possibility. This chamber might be a repository, a cradle, or a prison for something ancient, something that had been hidden from the world until now. The harmonic tones intensified, layering over themselves in a dizzying crescendo, and the shadows danced more violently across the walls, the atmosphere charged with an almost tangible intelligence. Somewhere in the far reaches of the chamber, a faint glimmer hinted at a hidden passage, a corridor that twisted out of sight, and the boy's gaze shifted toward it, calm, knowing, and inviting. Harrow realized, with a mix of trepidation and irresistible curiosity, that this was only the beginning of a revelation that could unravel everything he thought he knew, about life itself. The hidden corridor revealed itself slowly, a narrow slit of darkness branching off from the main chamber. The air colder here, carrying a faint metallic temps that set their teeth on edge. The boy stepped forward without hesitation, each footfall silent against the smooth, almost wet-looking stone, while Harrow and his team followed. Flashlights cutting through the oppressive blackness in wavering cones of light. The walls were etched with symbols, unfamiliar and yet hauntingly rhythmic, spiraling and angular at once, their meaning lost but the intent unmistakable: communication, warning, or invocation. As they progressed, the floor sloped gently downward, the sound of dripping water echoing like a slow heartbeat in the distance, each drop resonating within the walls as though the entire passage were a giant resonating chamber. The boy paused at intervals, fingertips grazing the carvings, and each touch seemed to trigger a faint glow that pulsed along the lines, revealing patterns previously invisible, as though the symbols themselves were alive, responding to his presence. Harrow felt an unsettling connection forming, a sense that the boy's mind was somehow intertwined with this place, attuned to frequencies and signals beyond normal perception. Faint murmurs, almost like whispers, echoed through the corridor, the source impossible to locate, weaving through the air and brushing against their consciousness, leaving impressions of shapes, faces, and fleeting memories that belonged to no one they knew. The temperature dropped further, breath condensing invisible clouds, and the walls began to feel less like stone and more like skin. Subtle undulations under the fingertips, faint warmth in places, as though the passage itself were a living organism, observing, testing, or guiding them. Every step carried a weight, a sense that leaving this path was no longer an option. Curiosity had become a tether, pulling them deeper into a labyrinth older than memory. At the corridor's end, the space opened into a vast subterranean hall, ceiling disappearing into darkness above, floor stretching beyond the limits of their light, and the air thrummed with the same harmonic resonance that had animated the central column. Here, massive structures rose like skeletal trees, translucent, organic, filled with shifting forms that seemed to breathe, pulse, and communicate in a language of movement and vibration rather than words. The boy raised his hands, and the forms shifted in unison, aligning into patterns that suggested not chaos but order, a hidden intelligence orchestrating every flicker and sway. Harrow realized the enormity of what lay before them: an ecosystem of consciousness, possibly ancient, entirely alien, yet intimately connected to the boy in ways science could scarcely begin to comprehend. The whispers grew into a low hum, enveloping their minds, suggesting secrets both wondrous and terrible, knowledge that could illuminate or unravel the very nature of life. As the team stood frozen at the edge of this immense, living cathedral, the boy turned his gaze to them, expression calm but unreadable, and with a voice that seemed both his and the chamber's. He asked a question that would haunt them long after. Are you ready to see what came before humanity? The halls seemed to breathe around them, every pulse of light and shadow creating a rhythm that synchronized with the thrum in their chests, a resonance that was at once exhilarating and disorienting. Harrow tried to focus on the structures, towering forms that shimmered with an inner translucence, revealing veins of flowing luminescence that twisted like rivers of liquid crystal, carrying shapes that were not solid but somehow meaningful, as if each curve and flicker was a symbol of memory, knowledge, or intent. The boy stepped forward, his hands moving through the air in subtle gestures, and the forms shifted, bending and coiling like smoke in response, folding into patterns that were impossible to describe in human terms, yet strangely familiar, resonating with something buried deep in the unconscious. The whispers intensified, layered voices speaking in a language that sounded older than civilization, more mathematical than spoken, conveying ideas in pulses of thought and feeling rather than syllables. Harrow felt a surge of vertigo, as if the chamber itself were folding around them, revealing glimpses of infinite corridors, realms within realms, each layered over the other, impossible to traverse fully yet perceptible in fleeting fragments. Some researchers might describe this as a hyperdimensional structure. Others suggest a psychic manifestation of collective memory, but no explanation seemed sufficient. It was something both alive and archival, a repository of experience that defied ordinary logic. The boy paused at the center, eyes closed, and the hall responded, shimmering more intensely, the walls vibrating faintly underfoot, projecting visions into their minds, images of landscapes lost to time, creatures that had never walked Earth, skies painted with colors that defied human vision, and civilizations rising and falling in moments that stretched and collapsed simultaneously. Each vision left an imprint, a sensation that was part memory, part instinct, whispering knowledge of survival, creation, and decay. Harrow wondered if this place had always existed, hidden beneath layers of history, unnoticed by human eyes, waiting for someone attuned to its frequencies to arrive. The team could feel a tension building, as if the chamber were evaluating them, assessing their intentions, their capacity to comprehend. The boy's voice echoed again, calm but edged with a strange authority. Everything you know, everything you are, is a fragment of what came before. To proceed is to risk forgetting who you are, and yet to turn back is to leave the truth unseen. A soft pulse of light rippled through the hall, enveloping them in warmth and dread simultaneously, and Harrow realized that the journey was no longer just about discovery. It was about choice, about stepping into knowledge that could illuminate or consume the very essence of their being. And in that suspended moment, the walls themselves seemed to breathe a single question into their minds. Would they embrace the past hidden in darkness, or retreat to the safety of ignorance? As the first glimmers of dawn crept through the narrow slits of the workhouse dormitories, the air hung heavy with the scent of damp straw, unwashed bodies, and a faint, lingering temps of despair that seemed to seep into the very walls. The Gaels who had survived the harrowing famine years moved silently among the shadows of the overcrowded rooms, each step careful, measured, as if the creak of floorboards could summon the ghosts of those who had perished within these same confines. Some researchers suggest that the utilitarian design of such institutions tended to make relief as unpleasant as possible, was a deliberate mechanism of social control, a cruel calculation to deter dependence. But the reality was far more immediate. Families torn apart, children huddled beneath tattered blankets, and bodies stacked in mass graves without coffins, a silent testimony to suffering. In County Cork, the Skibber Inn workhouse stood as a grim exemplar, its walls enclosing over 10,000 souls in spaces designed for mere hundreds, an architectural testament to systemic failure under the stress of famine. Those who fled Ireland carried the imprint of this misery across oceans, boarding coffin ships whose very names conjured the dread of death-laden voyages. Hasty conversions of cargo vessels to human transport left passengers in stifling holds, with scarce food and fouled water, where typhus and dysentery spread like wildfire. Mortality rates sometimes exceeded 20%. the cries of the sick echoing off wooden hulls, mingling with the salt-laden air and the relentless sway of the Atlantic, leaving indelible marks on survivors whose memories would shape the communities they established abroad. New York became a critical gateway, Castle Garden and later Ellis Island processing hundreds of thousands of weary, impoverished arrivals, their few possessions clutched as though they were talismans against a future unknown. The Five Points district grew dense with these Irish immigrants, a labyrinth of narrow alleys and tenements where multiple families shared single rooms, malnutrition and disease persisting even after escape from famine. Discrimination greeted them in subtle and overt forms. They were deemed racially inferior, religiously suspect, yet their resilience forged new political structures. Tammany Hall rose to provide the patronage and protection that the government refused, with figures like John Kelly and Richard Croker navigating a murky world of corruption, influence, and survival. As we move next, we will explore how these networks extended far beyond urban politics, linking diaspora communities to Ireland itself, creating channels that would fund arm and inspire nationalist movements across the Atlantic, intertwining culture, struggle, and identity in ways that still echo through generations, beyond the crowded streets of New York and the political maneuverings of Tammany Hall. The Irish diaspora found employment in the raw, unforgiving landscapes of America's infrastructure projects, a realm where back-breaking labor and deadly conditions were the norm rather than the exception. Canals, railroads, and urban construction became the stages upon which Irish immigrants etched their survival, their hands calloused, their bodies scarred, yet their spirits unbroken. The Erie Canal, famously dubbed the Irish grave, demanded the labor of thousands. Men wielding primitive tools through disease-infested swamps, enduring extreme weather and relentless exhaustion, their temporary shelters offering scant protection from rain, cold, or the insects that swarmed mercilessly. Archaeological traces from these camps reveal the stark reality of life at the margins, makeshift huts, evidence of malnutrition, and mass burials testifying to accidents and disease that claimed lives before opportunity could be grasped. From one frontier to the next, the California gold rush of 1849 beckoned the ambitious, promising wealth that contrasted sharply with the urban squalor left behind. Irish miners braved treacherous mountain trails, rivers swollen with spring runoff, and hostile interactions with American prospectors determined to guard their claims, all while maintaining fragile networks of mutual support. Small settlements emerged, islands of Gaelic culture in a landscape dominated by gold, fever, and survivalist pragmatism, where music, storytelling, and communal rituals carried the memory of home across an ocean and through perilous terrain. Meanwhile, across the globe in Australia, Irish immigrants faced a different reality. Their communities shaped by both forced transportation as convicts and voluntary migration in the 19th century. Their Gaelic traditions adapted to a harsher climate and a new social order, as settlers built hybrid architectural forms from local materials, churches and communal halls that resonated with the echoes of Ireland. The Catholic Church became a cornerstone, providing both spiritual sustenance and cultural continuity, with Irish priests establishing parishes that conducted services in their native tongue whenever possible, maintaining connections to ancestral heritage. Through these networks, whether in urban America or rural Australia, Irish immigrants preserved music, dance, and oral traditions, often in secretive or semi-public gatherings, ensuring that even as landscapes changed, the essence of Gaelic identity remained. As we move further into the story, we encounter the organized cultural revival in Ireland itself, where the Gaelic League, the GAA, and collectors of folklore sought to reclaim what centuries of conquest and colonization had threatened to erase, weaving a web of language, sport, and storytelling that would ripple through both the homeland and the diaspora, a quiet yet insistent defiance against the erasure of a people's soul. As Ireland itself began to stir with cultural resurgence in the late 19th century, the Gaelic revival emerged as a deliberate, almost insurgent attempt to reclaim a heritage that had been overshadowed by centuries of English rule, famine, and emigration. Organizations like the Gaelic League, founded in 1893 by Douglas Hyde and Owen MacNeill, were not merely social clubs. They were deliberate attempts to reconstruct an identity, to breathe life into a language and set of traditions that had survived in whispers and small communities despite suppression. The League offered classes in Irish, often taught in simple community halls, where the crackle of the peat fire mingled with the soft murmur of learners, repeating words that had not been spoken in their homes for generations. Some researchers suggest that the emphasis on language was as much political as cultural, a subtle resistance against assimilation, while others see it as a purely cultural revival, a romantic rediscovery of roots long neglected. Alongside language, the collection and preservation of folklore became a central mission. Scholars and enthusiasts such as Lady Gregory and Jeremiah Curtin travelled across remote regions, recording stories, songs, and customs from elderly storytellers whose memories stretched back to times before the famine. These tales, rich in supernatural motifs, moral lessons, and historical recollections, offered a window into pre-conquest Gaelic society, revealing both its sophistication and its humanity. The Gaelic Athletic Association, founded in 1884 by Michael Cusack and Maurice Davin, complemented these efforts by offering a living, physical expression of Irish culture. Through hurling, Gaelic football, and other uniquely Irish sports, communities could gather, compete, and celebrate traditions that were distinctly their own. Fields were cleared by hand, makeshift goalposts erected, and local rivalries flourished, fostering a sense of pride and cohesion that transcended the pressures of Anglicization. Importantly, the GAA discouraged participation in foreign sports, reflecting the conviction that cultural survival required boundaries, a deliberate separation from the pervasive influence of English leisure practices. In parallel, the Highland Land League in Scotland and its campaigns for tenant rights echoed similar impulses, a blending of political activism and cultural preservation, demonstrating that the defense of language, music, and local custom could not be separated from the struggle for social and economic justice. Together, these movements, Irish and Scottish, highlight the interplay of resilience and adaptation. They reveal communities painstakingly reconstructing identities that had been fractured by conquest, famine, and emigration, using language, sport, and folklore as both shield and weapon. Yet even as these structures took root, questions lingered. Could a culture so repeatedly displaced and suppressed truly endure? Or were these revival efforts destined to be gestures of nostalgia rather than foundations for the future? The turn of the 20th century brought the Gaelic revival from the intimate spaces of rural halls and athletic fields into the charged atmosphere of political upheaval, where culture and national identity became inseparable from the struggle for sovereignty. As Douglas Hyde had argued decades earlier, the survival of Ireland as a distinct nation depended not merely on political independence, but on the reclamation of language, customs, and traditions that had been systematically suppressed. In this charged climate, the Gaelic League's members often found themselves drawn into the currents of political radicalism, whether intentionally or by circumstance, as the question of Ireland's future grew ever more urgent. Figures such as Patrick Pearse and Eamon David, who had been active in language revival and education, would later emerge as leaders in the Easter Rising of 1916, demonstrating the inextricable link between cultural preservation and political action. The Rising itself, brief and brutal, was suffused with symbolism, proclamations read in both Irish and English, flags raised, and streets filled with the echoes of a heritage long denied a voice. For those who survived, the aftermath was both crushing and galvanizing. British reprisals were swift and severe, executions of leaders transforming them into martyrs whose deaths cemented the idea that cultural revival and political freedom were inseparable. Meanwhile, the Irish diaspora watched closely, offering both moral and financial support, connecting the struggles of the homeland to communities in America, Australia, and beyond. In towns and cities thousands of miles away, Irish language classes, cultural clubs, and athletic associations became conduits for solidarity, linking distant lives through shared memory and identity. Archaeological and archival evidence from these diaspora communities reveals how physical spaces, from modest parish halls to improvised sporting grounds, served as stages for rituals of identity, lessons in the Irish language, gatherings for Saily dances, and performances of traditional music. The Gaelic revival also coincided with advances in printing and mass communication, allowing newspapers, journals, and pamphlets to spread nationalist ideas and celebrate cultural achievements. Publications such as An Cléadhem sa Luas became vehicles for promoting literature, folklore, and Irish language education, reaching audiences far beyond the confines of small communities. Yet for all this momentum, challenges persisted. English remained dominant in schools and administration. Economic pressures continued to push young Irish speakers towards cities and overseas migration, and not all segments of society embraced the revival. Tensions simmered between cultural idealists and practical realities, between the desire to preserve authenticity and the pressures of modernization. And yet, despite uncertainty and opposition, the Gaelic revival planted seeds that would define the cultural and political trajectory of Ireland for decades to come, leaving us with a haunting question. Could the rebirth of a language, a sport, a story, truly withstand the relentless currents of history? Or was it destined to survive only in memory? With the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922, the Gaelic revival moved from the realm of cultural aspiration into the sphere of government policy, offering unprecedented opportunities to institutionalize language and heritage, while simultaneously confronting the complexities of a modernizing nation. The new constitution enshrined Irish as the national language, mandating its teaching in schools and creating a framework for the preservation of traditional culture. Yet the practical implementation revealed the tension between ideology and daily life. In predominantly Irish-speaking regions, the creation of Gaeltacht areas provided a rare sanctuary where native speakers could maintain their language and customs. But even these regions faced economic hardship, isolation, and the pull of English-dominated urban centres. Archaeological evidence, school records, and local archives from the Gaeltacht reveal modest classrooms, community halls, and makeshift cultural centres where Irish was spoken, sung, and taught, spaces alive with the determination to resist linguistic erosion. Beyond the Gaeltacht, Urban education initiatives sought to cultivate new generations of Irish speakers, establishing Irish medium schools where the language became the primary medium of instruction for nearly every subject. These schools, often operating in converted buildings or modest purpose-built structures, demanded a rigorous adaptation from students and teachers alike, forging a living connection between heritage and contemporary education. Radio and print media soon followed as crucial tools in reinforcing cultural identity. Irish language programming on the radio brought music, news, and storytelling into homes across Ireland, while newspapers and periodicals provided reading material and guidance for teachers and learners. The 1920s and 1930s witnessed a slow but persistent expansion of these cultural networks, linking rural communities, urban centres, and diaspora populations abroad, reinforcing a sense of shared identity despite geographical separation. Yet challenges remained. Industrialization, urban migration, and the pervasive influence of English-language media continually eroded the reach of Irish, leaving young generations exposed to the allure of globalized culture. Scholars and policymakers grappled with these pressures, debating strategies for balancing cultural preservation with modernization, understanding that survival depended not only on legislation but on genuine engagement from the population. Meanwhile, the arts flourished alongside educational initiatives. Traditional music, dance, and literature were revitalized, often blending historical forms with contemporary influences, producing hybrid cultural expressions that were unmistakably Irish yet dynamic and evolving. In the midst of these efforts, the question lingered: could a language suppressed for centuries, and a culture battered by famine, colonization, and diaspora, truly reassert itself in the rhythms of everyday life? Or would it remain a fragile relic cherished only in classrooms, performance halls, and ceremonial rituals, a ghost of what once had been? The story of the Gaels is not confined to the rugged coasts of Ireland or the scattered enclaves of the diaspora. It extends into the modern era, where language, media, and technology intersect in unexpected ways to shape cultural survival. With the rise of radio in the 1920s, Irish language programming began reaching listeners far beyond the Gaeltacht, transmitting songs, stories, and news that knitted together dispersed communities, offering both a lifeline to traditional culture and a bridge to contemporary life. By the 1960s, the first tentative steps into television brought glimpses of Gaelic life into living rooms across the country. But it was not until 1996, with the launch of TG4, that Irish language broadcasting took on a coherent, sustained form, offering entertainment, news, and educational content entirely in Irish. These media platforms created new spaces where language could thrive, but also exposed the persistent tension between authenticity and modernization. Digital technologies in the 21st century further transformed the landscape, with websites, social media, and online courses enabling learners from every corner of the world to access Irish language and culture, democratizing education in ways that were unimaginable to earlier generations. Some scholars suggest that this global accessibility has created a dual identity for modern Gaels, rooted in tradition yet capable of navigating the demands of a connected, multilingual world. Online communities allow for the sharing of music, literature, and folklore, creating a virtual Gaeltacht where language, storytelling, and cultural expression exist without geographical constraints. However, the dominance of English in global communications continues to exert pressure, challenging the retention of traditional practices and linguistic fluency, and raising questions about what it means for a culture to survive in the digital age. Meanwhile, Irish medium education has flourished, with urban primary and secondary schools teaching all subjects through Irish, producing generations of students who speak the language fluently while fully participating in modern society. These schools have become incubators for cultural revival, instilling in students not only linguistic skills, but a sense of identity tied to centuries of history, struggle, and creativity. In Northern Ireland, Irish language initiatives have navigated politically sensitive landscapes, asserting cultural identity while negotiating historical divides, reflecting the ongoing interplay between culture, politics, and community. The challenges are immense. Urbanization, globalization, and shifting economic priorities continue to pull young people away from traditional forms of Gaelic life, while media and technology offer both opportunities and distractions. Yet the story of the Gaels persists, a narrative of resilience, adaptation, and creativity, where songs, stories, and languages survive in classrooms, digital spaces, and hearts across the world. As you imagine the voices of children reading Irish in a modern classroom, or musicians performing Gaelic songs streamed across continents, one cannot help but wonder how will these threads of ancient culture weave into the fabric of a globalized future, and what forms will they take as they continue to evolve. As we reach the present day, the Gaels' story unfolds in a world that is at once familiar and radically transformed, where ancient traditions confront the pressures of globalization, modernity, and cultural homogenization. Across Ireland and Scotland, the rhythms of daily life pulse with the sounds of a language that once teetered on the brink of disappearance, now reverberating through classrooms, radio waves, television screens, and the vast expanse of the internet. The proliferation of Irish and Scottish Gaelic media-dedicated channels, online streaming, podcasts, and social platforms has created unprecedented opportunities for connection, allowing speakers scattered across continents to participate in a living, breathing cultural ecosystem. Some researchers point to these developments as evidence that minority languages can thrive even amidst global pressures, while others caution that the very tools enabling this revival also expose young speakers to the dominant cultures and languages that threaten to dilute their heritage. Beyond language, traditional music, dance, and storytelling continue to flourish, evolving in ways that honor the past while embracing contemporary influences. Festivals, competitions, and cultural gatherings attract participants from every corner of the globe, reinforcing networks of identity and shared history. Yet, the survival of Gaelic culture depends not merely on celebration, but on adaptation. Urban Gaeltacht schools produce fluent speakers capable of navigating modern professional, technological, and social landscapes, blending ancient knowledge with contemporary skill. Similarly, Irish and Scottish literature, film, and visual arts have found international audiences, their stories shaped by centuries of hardship, migration, and resilience, yet resonating universally in a world hungry for narrative depth and authenticity. Even as economic modernization, digital media, and global mobility challenge traditional modes of cultural transmission, the Gaels continue to find inventive ways to sustain their heritage. Online communities, virtual language courses, and digital archives extend the reach of Gaelic culture, creating spaces where history, folklore, and contemporary creativity converge. And while the number of native speakers may fluctuate, the spirit of the Gaels endures, carried by millions who identify with their heritage, sing their songs, and tell their stories, ensuring that this ancient culture remains vibrant, dynamic, and ever-evolving. The Gaels' journey across millennia is a testament to resilience, to the power of community and identity, and to the delicate balance between preserving the past and embracing the future. As you lie back, letting the echoes of their history wash over you, consider the centuries of survival, adaptation, and ingenuity that have brought these voices to you tonight. And in that quiet, lingering thought, one might ask, what will the next chapter of Gaelic history look like? And how will future generations continue to weave the ancient and the modern into a living, breathing culture that refuses to fade? As the decades progressed, Irish language and culture faced the dual pressures of globalization and modernization. Yet the mid-20th century also saw remarkable innovations that sought to ensure the survival of Gaelic traditions. Radio Éireann, beginning in the 1920s and expanding through the 1930s and 1940s, became a lifeline for Irish-speaking communities, transmitting music, stories, news, and folklore into homes that might otherwise have been isolated from the wider cultural revival. The broadcasts were more than entertainment. They were acts of preservation, threading connections between rural Gaeltacht areas, urban learners, and the scattered Irish diaspora. The arrival of television in the 1960s added a new dimension to this cultural ecosystem. Initially, Irish language programming was sporadic, often limited to news segments or occasional cultural features, yet the seeds were planted for more comprehensive representation. By the 1970s and 1980s, pressure from language advocates, educators, and cultural organizations led to the creation of dedicated Irish language channels, culminating in the launch of TG4 in 1996, a full-scale platform for news, entertainment, drama, and educational programming entirely in Irish. These developments provided both visibility and legitimacy to the language, embedding it within daily life in ways that had been unthinkable just a generation prior. Schools, radio, and television were complemented by the rise of community-based initiatives, from local drama groups and musical ensembles to storytelling circles and cultural festivals, all serving as living laboratories of Irish tradition. Archaeological studies of these community centres reveal modest yet bustling spaces where generations intersected, grandparents teaching songs to grandchildren, amateur actors performing plays based on folklore, and local musicians preserving rhythms that had echoed across centuries. Yet for all these achievements, challenges remained pressing. Urbanization and economic migration continued to draw young people away from rural heartlands, where native speakers were concentrated, and the dominance of English in commerce, media, and popular culture presented a subtle but relentless threat. The tension between commercial viability and cultural authenticity often emerged in music, literature, and media production, as creators navigated the need to engage audiences while retaining the distinctive elements of Gaelic identity. Despite these pressures, the Irish language and cultural practices displayed remarkable resilience, evolving to meet the demands of a modern nation without entirely abandoning their historical roots. The question persisted, quietly haunting advocates and learners alike, in a world increasingly dominated by English and globalized culture. Could Irish truly flourish, or would it be constrained to niche spaces, celebrated as heritage but not lived as a daily language? The answer, for many, remained as elusive and compelling as the haunting melodies of the Irish fiddle itself, echoing across the hills and valleys where generations had fought, suffered, and survived to keep their voice alive. From the airwaves to the classroom, The spread of Irish medium education became a defining feature of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, providing new avenues for the survival and growth of the language while reshaping perceptions of Irish identity. The establishment of Gaelscoileanna primary and secondary schools, teaching entirely through Irish, reflected a remarkable shift in societal attitudes, where parents in urban centres demanded that their children be fluent in the ancestral tongue. Despite living in overwhelmingly English-speaking environments, these schools did more than teach a language. They created immersive cultural spaces where history, literature, music, and folklore were intertwined with everyday learning, allowing students to experience Irish as a living, breathing medium rather than a relic of the past. Graduates of these programs emerged with a dual fluency, comfortable in English yet deeply connected to Irish heritage, capable of navigating modern society while maintaining a tangible link to centuries of cultural tradition. Beyond Ireland's borders, similar initiatives arose, responding to the needs of diaspora communities determined to retain linguistic and cultural continuity. In Northern Ireland, Irish language schools offered an alternative to the traditional sectarian divide, emphasizing cultural identity over religious affiliation, and fostering a subtle form of reconciliation through shared heritage. The growth of Irish language media, including radio, television, print, and eventually digital platforms, complemented educational initiatives by creating constant exposure and reinforcing the language as a functional tool for communication. Online courses, virtual libraries, streaming media, and social networks emerged as global lifelines for learners, connecting thousands of Irish speakers worldwide who would otherwise remain isolated. Yet the challenges of modernization persisted. The lure of English as a dominant language for commerce, technology, and popular culture continually threatened to erode these gains, and the pressures of urbanization drew young Irish speakers away from rural Gaeltacht areas, the traditional heartlands of linguistic transmission. Despite these pressures, the Irish language demonstrated remarkable adaptability, evolving to accommodate new concepts, technologies, and contexts, producing terminology for modern professions, digital interfaces, and scientific fields while retaining its distinctive phonetics, syntax, and idiomatic richness. The cultural resonance of Irish language music, literature, and media proved equally powerful, allowing the language to thrive not only as a means of communication but as a source of identity, pride, and creative expression. And yet, even with schools filled with eager students, radio waves carrying ancient songs, and digital networks linking diaspora communities, one must ask, can a language whose roots stretch back millennia survive, fully intact in a globalized world where English dominates every facet of life? Or will Irish ultimately exist as a treasured echo of history, cherished but partially lost? The answer, like the mist over a Donegal hillside at dawn, is uncertain, shimmering on the horizon between survival and fading memory. As we move from classrooms and airwaves to the lived reality of Irish-speaking communities, the Gaeltacht regions emerge as both bastions of tradition and fragile testaments to cultural survival. These scattered pockets along Ireland's western coast and islands, windswept and isolated, have long served as the crucibles where language, music, folklore, and daily life coalesced into a singularly Gaelic experience. Walking through a Gaeltacht village, one can imagine the cadence of conversations rolling off the Atlantic winds, the laughter of children playing traditional games in narrow lanes, and the scent of peat fires mingling with the brine of the sea. Yet these communities have always been under pressure. Economic necessity, emigration, and the inexorable pull of modern life threaten to dilute centuries of linguistic continuity. Some researchers note that while these regions retain their linguistic identity, the younger generations often inhabit a liminal space, fluent in English yet culturally tethered to Irish heritage, negotiating between two worlds. Archaeological studies, census records, and oral histories reveal the patterns of survival and adaptation, showing how families balanced subsistence farming, fishing, and seasonal labor with the need to preserve the Irish tongue, often passing it on through songs, storytelling, and domestic instruction. From one village to the next, subtle variations in pronunciation, vocabulary, and folk practice illustrate the rich tapestry of local identity, each microcosm a repository of centuries of adaptation and resilience. Across the sea, diaspora communities mirrored these dynamics in miniature, recreating Gaelic enclaves in North America, Australia, and beyond, where Irish immigrants strove to maintain language, music, dance, and Catholic traditions amidst alien environments. In cities like Boston, Chicago, Sydney, and Melbourne, Irish associations, Gaelic football clubs, and language classes became lifelines connecting the scattered, often weary immigrant populations to a sense of home that transcended geography. Yet the Gaeltacht and the diaspora share a tension, the constant negotiation between preserving a living heritage and adapting to contemporary realities, a struggle that has defined Gaelic culture for centuries. As globalization accelerates, questions arise about the viability of these enclaves, whether physical or cultural, and the methods through which language and tradition can survive when they must compete with global media, economic pressures, and shifting social priorities. Sit back, relax, and imagine the Atlantic wind sweeping across the cliffs of Connemara, the sound of Gaelic songs drifting from a distant cottage, carrying with them the whispers of ancestors. How much of this delicate, centuries-old world can truly endure in the uncertain currents of the modern age? Imagine, if you will, a world wrapped in mist, where rugged hills rise like silent sentinels over windswept valleys, and the whispers of centuries echo through stone circles and forgotten ruins. This is the land of the Gaels, a people whose story stretches across millennia, surviving conquest, famine, and diaspora, yet somehow maintaining a distinct identity that refuses to fade. Sit back, relax, and let your mind drift into the dense fog of history, where every hill, river, and settlement carries the weight of human triumph and tragedy. From their earliest days in prehistoric Europe, the Gaels developed cultures deeply entwined with the land, crafting tools, dwellings, and symbols that would leave traces visible even today, etched into the soil and preserved in the archaeological record. Some researchers believe that their language, music, and social structures were already remarkably sophisticated, while others suggest that the lack of written records masks the true complexity of their early civilization. What is certain, however, is that the Gaels endured, adapting to waves of migration, invasion, and climate pressures that reshaped the landscapes they called home. Their resilience is perhaps most evident during the famine years, when institutions built on utilitarian principles forced the destitute into grim workhouses, overcrowded and unsanitary, with families torn apart in exchange for mere sustenance. The skeletal remains uncovered in mass graves from these sites tell a haunting story of human suffering. of lives truncated in silence, leaving behind questions that archaeology alone cannot fully answer. And yet, from this despair arose movement people, fleeing hunger and death, crossing oceans on vessels so perilous that they earned the chilling nickname coffin ships, where mortality rates soared above 20% on some journeys, spreading disease and desperation through cramped holds. As these migrants reached distant lands from New York's Lower Manhattan to the goldfields of California, and even across oceans to Australia, they carried with them fragments of language, music, and memory, planting seeds of Irish culture that would grow in the shadows of foreign cities. How, then, did these scattered communities manage to preserve their heritage, to keep Gaelic traditions alive across continents and generations? The answer, as we will explore, lies not only in the endurance of the people themselves, but in the power of culture, language, and community to survive even the harshest trials, whispering stories across time, waiting for us to listen. And as we begin this journey into the vast, layered history of the Gaels, we must ask, what mysteries lie hidden in the fog of their past, waiting to be discovered? To understand the Gaels, we must step further back into an age before kingdoms, before clans, before the familiar patterns of Celtic identity took shape, an era where Europe itself was a patchwork of migrating peoples, shifting climates, and cultural experiments unfolding across forests, plains, and river valleys. Sit back, relax, and let your mind drift across this ancient landscape, a world where bronze tools glinted in firelight and the earliest Proto-Celtic languages were forming in the mouths of wanderers who did not yet know how far their influence would spread. Some researchers believe the roots of the Gaels stretch into the Urnfield culture of Central Europe, where communities buried their dead in vast fields of pottery urns, each containing ash and bone-quiet testimonies to lives lived in cycles of work, ritual, and war. Others suggest that the story begins slightly later, during the Halsted period, when iron weapons, elaborate chieftain burials, and aristocratic warrior elites emerged across the Alps, marking the birth of a more recognizable Celtic identity. In this world, every clang of metal, every carved spiral, every fortified hilltop settlement stood as a statement of power, resilience, and ambition. Yet the Gaels were not static. Their ancestors were part of a great wave of migrations that flowed westward like a tide, bringing new technologies, beliefs, and languages into the Atlantic fringes of Europe. Imagine families moving slowly along forested ridges and winding rivers, ox-drawn, carts creaking under the weight of tools and precious goods, dogs weaving through the march, and warriors scouting ahead with iron-tipped spears catching reflections of the sun. These migrations were not sudden surges, but long, steady movements across centuries, shaped by trade routes, climatic shifts, and alliances that we can only glimpse through the scattered remains they left behind. When these early Celtic-speaking peoples reached the shores of Ireland and the Highlands of Scotland, they encountered landscapes rich with mystery, ancient tombs older than the pyramids, stone circles aligned with the heavens, and communities whose origins are still debated by archaeologists. Some believe these newcomers merged peacefully with local populations, blending languages, practices, and beliefs into something distinctly Gaelic. Others suggest there were conflictually grinding struggles for land and cattle, fought across windswept hills and boggy plains. Whatever the truth, a new culture was taking root, shaped by the land itself. Every hill fort, every ring fort, every ritual site became part of a living tapestry that would define Gaelic identity for centuries. As this world expanded, another question emerged like a shadow on the horizon. How did these early Gaels transform from scattered tribal groups into societies with kings, warrior bands, and complex laws that governed every aspect of life? The answer leads us deeper into their evolving world, where power, poetry, warfare, and spirituality intertwined in ways that still capture our imagination. To follow the trail of the Gaels into their earliest settlements, we step into an island in Scotland far different from the landscapes we know today, wilder, thicker with forests, alive with the cries of wolves and the rustle of deer moving through undergrowth. Sit back, relax, and imagine that world unfolding around you, where small clusters of roundhouses stood perched on ridges or nestled in valleys, their thatched roofs glowing with the soft flicker of hearth fires. Archaeologists uncover these settlements through rings of post holes, shards of pottery, and traces of ancient pathways that hint at daily rhythms long forgotten. Some researchers believe the first Gaelic-speaking communities established themselves around fortified ring-foot stows, iconic circular enclosures of earth and wood that still dot the countryside like ancient fingerprints. Others suggest that lake dwellings, called crannigs, built on artificial islands of timber and stone, served as early hubs of power and security, rising out of dark waters like quiet fortresses. What is certain is that these people understood the land intimately, shaping their lives around the cycles of the seasons, the movements of their cattle, and the rituals that bound their communities together. Cattle were more than animals. They were wealth, currency, and power, determining social rank and fueling rivalries between families and clans. In this early Gaelic world, a person's status could rise or fall with the health of their herds, and entire conflicts could ignite over grazing rights or stolen livestock. Imagine the distant sound of hooves echoing over a misty plain, the low bellow of bulls carrying through dawn's silence, the smell of fresh earth churned by animals returning to their enclosures. Alongside these rhythms of work and survival, the Gaels cultivated a deep spiritual relationship with their surroundings. Forest clearings became ritual sites, rivers and lakes were seen as portals to the other world, and altars of stone or wood marked the boundaries between the visible and the unseen. Offerings of weapons, jewelry, and carved idols were placed in sacred waters, a gesture of respect, fear, or supplication to forces beyond human grasp. Every act, from harvesting grain to forging tools, carried an echo of ritual significance. And yet, even as these communities grew, questions linger about how they were governed. Some historians suggest early Gaelic society was loose and kin-based, shaped by family alliances and shifting loyalties. Others imagine more formal structures, with chieftains presiding over disputes, allocating land, and maintaining fragile peace among neighboring groups. Whatever the truth, this world set the foundation for everything that would come later, a world where landscape, cattle, spirituality, and kinship formed the backbone of Gaelic identity. But as these early societies settled deeper into their lands, another challenge emerged on the horizon: how to protect their people, their cattle, and their honor in a landscape where rivalry was ever present and alliances could change with the turn of a season.